The DC amps meter indicates the amperage of the DC source selected by the DC meter selector, while the DC volts meter indicates the voltage of that source. The DC meter selector is a 7-position rotary switch used to select the source of inputs to the DC meter. When the standby power position is selected on the DC meter selector, the DC volts meter displays the voltage of the DC standby bus, which is normally 28 volts, and the DC amps meter displays no amperes because the DC amps meter is not connected when the DC standby bus is selected. Now touch the DC meter selector to move it to the battery bus position. When the battery bus position is selected, the DC volts meter displays the voltage of the battery bus, and the DC amps meter again displays no amperes, because the amp meter is not connected when the battery bus is selected. Now touch the DC meter selector to move it to the battery position. When the DC meter selector is placed to the battery position, the DC volts meter displays DC voltage of the battery through the hot battery bus when the charger is not powered, and charging voltage when the charger is powered. The DC amps meter displays the rate of battery charge or discharge. The DC amps meter indications vary according to conditions. The DC amps meter will indicate to the left of 0 if the battery is discharging, to the right of 0 if the battery is charging, and at exactly 0 when the battery is fully charged or there's no draw on the battery. When the battery voltage drops below 26 volts, the battery charger charges the battery, which is indicated by a pulsing cycle of approximately 2 minutes. Now touch the DC meter selector to move it to the TR1 position. When the TR1 position is selected, the DC amps meter indicates the load carried in amps by TR1, which is normally about 12 amps, and the DC volts meter indicates the voltage at DC bus 1. The maximum DC amps meter reading you should allow for any TR is 65 amps with cooling and 50 amps without cooling. Now touch the DC meter selector to move it to the TR2 position. When the DC meter selector is positioned to TR2, the DC amps meter indicates the load carried in amps by TR2, and the DC volts meter indicates the voltage at DC bus 2. Now touch the DC meter selector to position it to TR3. When the DC meter selector is positioned to TR3, the meters indicate amps and voltage output at TR3. The test position is used by maintenance. The 2-position battery switch controls the power to the battery bus. If the battery switch is positioned to on, the battery bus is powered from either of its normal source, TR, or its alternate source, the hot battery bus. If the battery switch is positioned to on, the battery bus will change power sources automatically. Now touch the battery switch to position it to off. If the battery switch is positioned to off, all power to the battery bus is removed. Now touch the standby power switch to move it to the battery position. However, if the standby power switch is in the battery position, the battery bus is powered by the hot battery bus regardless of the battery switch position. Note that the switched hot battery bus remains unpowered in this configuration.